Robert William Pickton. For nearly 5 years, women were disappearing from a stretch of Vancouver's downtown east side, and almost no one in authority seemed to notice. Most were Indigenous. Most worked in the sex trade. Their families reported them missing, and the files went into drawers. When the answer finally came, it was found on a pig farm in Port Coquitlam, roughly 40 minutes outside the city. Investigators would eventually recover the remains or DNA of 33 women from that property. The man who lived there had been on their radar as far back as 1997. It had taken them 5 more years to arrest him. Robert William Pickton, known to almost everyone as Willie, was born in October of 1949 and had spent his entire life on the family pig farm he ran with his brother David. He was 52 years old at the time of his arrest, described by neighbors as quiet, disheveled, and unremarkable. The women he targeted were adults from Vancouver's downtown east side, a neighborhood long neglected by police and social services. Among those confirmed by conviction were Serena Abotswe, Mona Wilson, Andrea Josbury, Georgina Papin, Marnie Frey, and Brenda Wolfe. Pickton's name first surfaced in police files in 1997, but the case that would grow into the largest serial killer investigation in Canadian history moved slowly. It was not until February 22, 2002, that officers finally executed a search warrant on the Port Coquitlam farm. The property was treated as one massive crime scene, sifted for months by forensic teams. The remains or DNA of 33 women were eventually identified, many of them women whose disappearances had gone almost uninvestigated for years. He was charged with 26 counts of first-degree murder. A single trial covering all of them was ruled too overwhelming for any jury to weigh, so the counts were split. 6 were selected to go first. How does a case with 26 charges end with only 6 convictions? The trial opened in the Supreme Court of British Columbia before Justice James Williams. The most damaging evidence was a secretly recorded jail cell conversation in which Pickton spoke to an undercover officer, describing himself as ruined and effectively confessing to being a mass murderer. He also told the officer he had gotten sloppy at the end and that he had wanted to reach a round number of 50. On December 9, 2007, the jury returned its verdict. Not the first-degree murder the Crown had sought, but 6 counts of second-degree murder. 2 days later, on December 11th, he was sentenced to 6 concurrent life terms with no parole eligibility for 25 years. That was the maximum available for second-degree murder at the time. Both sides appealed. The defense challenged the conviction on 6 separate grounds. The Crown cross-appealed, arguing the jury should have been permitted to convict on the more serious first-degree charge. In 2010, the British Columbia Court of Appeal upheld the convictions, and the Supreme Court of Canada followed suit that same year. On August 4th of 2010, the Crown stayed the remaining 20 first-degree charges. There would be no second trial. As of 2026, Robert Pickton is deceased. On May 19th of 2024, he was assaulted at Port Cartier Institution in Quebec by a fellow inmate. He died of his injuries 12 days later, on May 31st, at the age of 74. In July of 2025, an inmate named Martin Charest was charged with first-degree murder in connection with his death. The reckoning did not end at the prison gate. The case triggered the Missing Women Commission of Inquiry, led by Wally Opal, whose 1,448-page report, titled Forsaken, was released in December of 2012. It examined the disappearances of 67 women and issued 63 recommendations, along with 2 urgent measures. Every one of them was a statement about what the system had missed and who it had failed to look for. That failure to look, to see women who did not fit a certain profile of victimhood, is one thread in Canadian criminal history. Another runs through a Montreal engineering school on a December afternoon, when the reason a killer chose his victims was not that they were invisible, but precisely because of who they were. Marc Lépine. On the afternoon of December 6, 1989, a man walked into an engineering classroom at École Polytechnique de Montréal, ordered the men to leave, and then opened fire on the 9 women who remained. 6 of them were killed before he stepped back into the corridor. Over the next 20 minutes, he moved through hallways, the cafeteria, and another classroom. By the time he turned the rifle on himself, 14 women were dead and 14 more people were wounded. He had left behind a note explaining exactly why he had done it. The man was Marc Lépine, born Gamil Rodrigue Lias Garbi in October of 1964 in Montreal. He was 25 years old. He had applied to study at the very school he attacked and had been rejected. He had been raised largely by his mother, a Quebecoise nurse, after she separated from his father. The victims were all adult women, engineering students and staff members whose only common trait was that they were women pursuing a career in a field Lépine believed did not belong to them. Among the 14 killed were Maurice Lagunière, age 25, Maurice Leclerc, age 23, Anne-Marie Lemay, age 22, Sonia Pelletier, age 28, Michel Richard, age 21, Annie Saint-Arnaud, age 23, and Annie Turcotte, age 20. Of the 14 who were wounded that afternoon, 10 were women and 4 were men. Lépine had legally purchased the Ruger Mini 14 semi-automatic rifle he carried into the school. He also had a hunting knife. He entered the mechanical engineering classroom shortly after 4 in the afternoon, walked to the front, and told the roughly 60 students there to separate, men on one side, women on the other. The men complied and were ordered out. He then told the 9 women who remained that he was fighting feminism. He opened fire, killing 6 and wounding 3. He then left the room and continued through the building for just under 20 minutes, entering the cafeteria, corridors, and another classroom, moving toward women specifically. His final act was to end his own life. Beside his body, investigators recovered a letter blaming feminists for the failures of his own life. Along with a list of women in Quebec public life, he wrote that he had wanted to reach but had run out of time to pursue. There would be no trial. What kind of accountability follows a killing that ends with the killer's own death? The answer was legal and cultural, rather than judicial. In 1991, survivors and their families helped form the Coalition for Gun Control, and that same year, Parliament passed Bill C-17, introducing safety training and waiting periods for firearms. 4 years later, in 1995, the Firearms Act, Bill C-68, established a national long gun registry. Parliament also designated December 6th the National Day of Remembrance and Action on Violence Against Women, a date now marked every year across the country in schools, workplaces, and public ceremonies. One of the survivors, Natalie Provost, went on to become one of the most recognizable gun control advocates in Canada. Her name and the names of the 14 women who did not survive have been read aloud at commemorations every year since. For 31 years, the Polytechnique attack held the grim distinction of being the deadliest mass shooting in Canadian history. That record was surpassed only in 2020 by the Nova Scotia attack that took 22 lives. As of 2026, École Polytechnique continues to operate as an active engineering school, one that graduates more women engineers each year than were killed on the afternoon of the attack. A permanent memorial to the 14 women stands on Mont Royal, each of their names inscribed on it. Marc Lépine, dead by his own hand at the scene in 1989, was never subject to any court proceeding. Where Lépine chose women he did not know, the case that follows turned on the opposite pattern. A man who chose women he had once shared his life with and reached each of them within a matter of hours. Basil Borutsky. On the morning of September 22, 2015, a man in rural eastern Ontario left his apartment shortly after 7:30, drove to a cottage, and strangled the woman who lived there. He then drove to a second home and shot the woman who lived there, then a third. All three had once been his partners. All three were dead within about 2 hours of one another. Two of the three had been living with warnings about him for years. Basil Borutsky was 57 years old at the time, a resident of Palmer Rapids in Renfrew County. He had a lengthy criminal record, including prior convictions for violence against two of the three women he took the lives of that morning. Court records described a man who had refused every court-imposed condition he was ever given, and who had been out of prison at the time of the offenses on a peace bond he had also refused to sign. The three women were Carol Culleton, aged 66, an Ottawa woman who kept a cottage near Combermere; Anastasia Kuzik, aged 36, of Wilno; and Natalie Warmerdam, aged 48, of Foymount. All were adult women. All had ended relationships with Borutsky. All had, in different ways, reported concerns about him to authorities before that morning. The timeline of that day was reconstructed with unusual precision at trial. Borutsky left his apartment at about 7:36 in the morning. He drove to Carol Culleton's cottage first and strangled her with a cable cord. He then drove to Anastasia Kuzik's home, where he shot her. He then drove to Natalie Warmerdam's home, where he chased her through the house and shot her as she tried to flee. By roughly 9:30 in the morning, all three were dead. He was arrested later that same day. How does a system prosecute a defendant who refuses to speak at his own trial? Borutsky never entered a plea. He represented himself. For 7 weeks, he sat in a Renfrew County courtroom, largely silent, refusing to participate in his own defense. On November 24, 2017, a jury convicted him of 2 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of Kuzik and Warmerdam, and 1 count of second-degree murder in the death of Culleton. On December 6th of that year, Justice Robert Moranger sentenced him to life imprisonment with no parole eligibility for 70 years. It was among the harshest sentences ever imposed in Canada. That sentence would eventually have been constitutionally vulnerable. In 2022, the Supreme Court of Canada would strike down consecutive parole ineligibility periods for multiple murders, a decision that reduced several comparable sentences across the country. Borutsky never lived to test his own on appeal. As of 2026, Basil Borutsky is deceased. He died in a maximum security prison west of Kingston, Ontario, on March 28, 2024, at the age of 66. The cause was reported as apparently natural. The case did not end with him. In June of 2022, a coroner's inquest into the killings released 86 recommendations. Many centered on how the justice system responds to warnings from women in the months and years before intimate partner violence turns fatal. In December of that year, Lanark County became the first municipality in Canada to formally declare intimate partner violence an epidemic. According to Lanark County Interval House, that resolution paved the way for nearly 100 other municipalities across the country to follow. Borutsky's victims all knew the man who came for them. The case that follows turned on the opposite assumption, that the people most at risk were the ones who had been placed under the care of someone they trusted completely. Elizabeth Wettlaufer. For nearly a decade, a registered nurse working the overnight shift at long-term care homes in southwestern Ontario was quietly injecting elderly residents with insulin they did not need. 8 of them did not survive. 4 more nearly did not. In every case, the nurse charted the death, comforted the family, and moved on to her next shift. She was never caught by an investigation. She was caught in the end because she confessed. Elizabeth Tracy May Wettlaufer was born in June of 1967 in a small township near Woodstock, Ontario. She had been raised in a strict Baptist household and had become a registered nurse who worked primarily overnight in long-term care. She was in her late 40s by the time the killings came to light. She resigned from the College of Nurses of Ontario in September of 2016 as the investigation began. The 8 residents whose lives she took were all elderly adults, 5 women and 3 men, ranging in age from 75 to 96. Many were living with dementia. They included James Silcox, Maurice Granat, Gladys Millard, Helen Matheson, Mary Zurowinski, Helen Young, Maureen Pickering, and Arpad Horvath. 4 more residents survived attempted killings, and 2 others were harmed in aggravated assaults, 14 victims in total. The method was insulin. Wettlaufer injected residents with doses for which there was no medical justification. Insulin lowers blood sugar rapidly, and in a frail patient it can cause a death that looks, at first glance, like the ordinary decline of the very old. That is one of the reasons she was able to continue for as long as she did. There was no forensic red flag on any single death. Each was recorded as a passing. The investigation began in September of 2016, after Toronto police were alerted to statements she had made during a stay at a psychiatric hospital. She was interviewed. She confessed. She was arrested on October 25th of that year. How does a killing pattern this large go undetected for nearly a decade? The answer would take years of public inquiry to unpack. On June 1st, 2017, at the courthouse in Woodstock, Wettlaufer pleaded guilty to 8 counts of first-degree murder, 4 counts of attempted murder, and 2 counts of aggravated assault. A video of her full confession was played in court, in which she described what she called a red surging feeling, and an urge she said she could not control. On June 26, 2017, Justice Bruce Thomas sentenced her to life imprisonment with no parole eligibility for 25 years. In his remarks, he described her as a shadow that had passed over her victims on the night shifts she supervised, and added that without her own confessions, the offenses would almost certainly never have been prosecuted. She did not appeal. As of 2026, Elizabeth Wettlaufer remains incarcerated, serving her life sentence. Her earliest possible parole eligibility falls 25 years from her June 2017 sentencing. The public inquiry that followed was formally titled The Public Inquiry into the Safety and Security of Residents in the Long-Term Care Home System. It was led by Justice Eileen Gillies, and its 4-volume, 1,441-page report was released on July 31st, 2019. It concluded that the failures that allowed the killings were systemic rather than individual, a finding that placed the accountability well beyond one nurse, and it issued 91 recommendations covering how long-term care homes hire, supervise, medicate, and investigate. The Wettlaufer case turned on a killer whose targets never saw her as a threat. The final case in this half of the record turned on the opposite. A man in camouflage whose only intention was for the people he hunted to see exactly what was coming. Justin Bourque. On the evening of June 4th, 2014, a man in camouflage and carrying a semi-automatic rifle, walked through a residential neighborhood in Moncton, New Brunswick. He was not looking for civilians. He was looking for police. Within a matter of minutes, he had shot 5 Royal Canadian Mounted Police officers. 3 of them were dead. What followed was a manhunt that essentially shut down an entire city for the next 30 hours. Justin Bourque was 24 years old and lived in Moncton. He had been raised in a large homeschooled family and had drifted into an ideology built around distrust of government, admiration for firearms, and hostility toward authority. He had chosen the RCMP specifically because they represented, in his view, the state itself. The 3 officers he killed were Constable David Ross, aged 32, Constable Fabrice Georges Javaudin, aged 45, and Constable Douglas James Larche, aged 40. 2 more officers, Constable Eric Dubois and Constable Darlene Gauguin, were wounded but survived. All 5 were adults, each with families of their own. The shooting began on the evening of June 4th in a working-class residential area of the city's north end. Bourque, dressed in military-style clothing and heavily armed, was spotted by residents who called police. Officers who responded to those calls were the ones he shot. Once the killings began, the city itself came to a standstill. Schools, businesses, and government offices closed. Residents were told to stay inside and away from their windows. The manhunt ran for roughly 30 hours before he was arrested without further violence. In August of 2014, Bourque pleaded guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. His trial was scheduled for sentencing only, and the sentence that followed would break records. What does the harshest sentence in modern Canadian history actually look like on paper? On October 31st, 2014, Justice David Smith imposed a life sentence with no parole eligibility for 75 years. 3 consecutive 25-year periods stacked together under a law Parliament had passed in 2011. It was the longest parole ineligibility term in Canadian history, and the harshest sentence handed down in the country since the last executions carried out in 1962. That record did not stand. In May of 2022, the Supreme Court of Canada unanimously struck down the law that had permitted stacked parole ineligibility periods, finding it violated the Charter's protection against cruel and unusual punishment. That decision, known as R versus Bissonnette, applied backward as well as forward. In February of 2023, the New Brunswick Court of Appeal, describing itself as duty-bound by the Supreme Court's ruling, reduced Bourque's parole ineligibility from 75 years to 25, moving his earliest possible eligibility to roughly 2039. He has not been a quiet inmate since. In September of 2025, he received an additional 5-year sentence for aggravated assault and weapon possession stemming from the stabbing of another inmate in March of 2022. Because that sentence was ordered to be served concurrently, it did not extend his parole date. As of 2026, Justin Bourque is incarcerated at the Atlantic Institution, a maximum security facility in Renew, New Brunswick, still serving his life sentence. His case is now cited less for its own facts than for the legal shockwave it produced. Every mass killing sentenced under the 2011 consecutive parole law would eventually be measured against the ruling that cut Bourque's term back to 25 years, a ruling that would also reach into 2 of the cases still waiting in the second half of this record. Not subscribed yet? Now's the time. And if audio's more your thing, find us on Spotify too. You can click the link in our bio. Alexandre Bissonnette. On the evening of January 29th, 2017, Worshippers at a mosque in Quebec City were finishing their evening prayers when a man walked in and opened fire. His rifle jammed almost immediately. He kept going with a pistol. In under 2 minutes, 6 men were dead and 5 others were badly wounded. 17 children in the community lost their fathers that night. The gunman then left the building, called 911 from a bridge outside the city, and turned himself in. Alexandre Bissonnette was 27 years old, a university student at Université Laval and a former Army cadet. He had grown up in the Cap Rouge area of Quebec City. In the months before the attack, he had immersed himself in far-right and anti-immigrant material online. And by court accounts, that immersion had sharpened through 2016 into something more focused and more hostile. The 6 men killed inside the Islamic Cultural Center of Quebec City were all adults. They were Ibrahima Barry, aged 39, Mamadou Tanou Barry, aged 42, Khaled Belkacemi, aged 60, a professor at Université Laval, Aboubakar Thabti, aged 44, Abdelkrim Hassan, aged 41, and Azzedine Soufiane, aged 57, a grocer in the neighborhood who was killed while trying to physically stop the shooter. Soufiane was posthumously awarded the Star of Courage. 5 other worshippers survived serious injuries. Between the 6 men who died, 17 children were left without a father. The attack itself lasted less than 2 minutes. Bissonnette entered the mosque shortly after 8 in the evening, at the point when many worshippers were rising from prayer. His rifle jammed after only a few rounds. He drew a pistol and continued firing. He then walked back out to his car, drove off, and phoned emergency services from a bridge on the way out of the city. He surrendered without resistance when police arrived to arrest him. How does one afternoon in a courtroom lead to 3 separate sentences over 3 years? He pleaded guilty in March of 2019 to 6 counts of first-degree murder and 6 counts of attempted murder. The sentencing that followed became one of the most closely watched legal proceedings in modern Quebec history. A Superior Court judge initially imposed a life sentence with no parole eligibility for 40 years, using the 2011 law that permitted stacked parole ineligibility periods for multiple murders. In November of 2020, the Quebec Court of Appeal reduced that term to 25 years and, in doing so, ruled that the stacking law itself was unconstitutional. The Supreme Court of Canada took the case up. On May 27, 2022, in a unanimous 9-0 ruling written by Chief Justice Richard Wagner, the court agreed. The court found that depriving offenders of any possibility of reintegration into society in advance struck at the foundations of Canadian criminal law, and that Section 745.51 of the Criminal Code violated the Charter's protection against cruel and unusual punishment. It declared the provision invalid all the way back to its 2011 enactment and fixed Bissonnette's parole ineligibility at 25 years. That ruling reached far past his own case. It was the same decision that would, months later, cut Justin Bourque's 75-year term to 25, and would cap the sentence handed down to Alec Minassian only weeks later. As of 2026, Alexandre Bissonnette is incarcerated at Port Cartier Institution, a maximum security prison in northeastern Quebec, where he was transferred in September of 2023. His earliest possible parole eligibility falls in 2042. In April of 2026, he petitioned to be moved to a medium security facility. Prison administration had already refused a similar request the previous month. The Bissonnette ruling was still less than a year old when it landed on the desk of a Toronto judge weighing a sentence for another mass killing. That killing had taken place on a busy city sidewalk on a spring afternoon, and its defense rested on an argument the courts had rarely accepted. Alec Manassian. On the afternoon of April 23, 2018, a rented white van pulled onto a busy sidewalk along Yonge Street in the north end of Toronto and accelerated. It traveled roughly 2 kilometers, mounting curbs, striking pedestrians, and swerving to reach more. When the van finally stopped, 10 people were dead and 15 more were injured. An 11th victim would die of her injuries 3 years later. The driver got out, pointed something at the responding officer, and demanded to be shot. Alec Manassian was 25 years old, from Richmond Hill, north of Toronto. He had been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, a diagnosis that would sit at the center of his failed defense. He told police, both at the scene and later in interviews, that he had acted on behalf of what he called the incel movement, motivated by resentment toward women and a desire for infamy. Those killed on the day were adults. They were Renuka Amarasinghe, aged 45, Andrea Braddon, aged 33, Geraldine Brady, aged 83, Sohee Chung, aged 22, Anne-Marie D'Amico, aged 30, Mary Elizabeth Forsyth, aged 94, Chul Min Kong, aged 45, Ji Hoon Kim, aged 22, Munir Najjar, aged 85, and Dorothy Sewell, aged 80. 8 of the 10 were women. In October of 2021, an 11th victim, Amaresh Tesfamariam, aged 65, died of the injuries she had sustained that day. Her death was later ruled a homicide, but no new charge was laid, as too much time had passed for the count to be upgraded. The attack itself lasted roughly 10 minutes, from about 1:22 in the afternoon to 1:32. Manassian used the rented van as a weapon along one of the busiest commercial streets in the city. When Toronto Police Constable Ken Lamb intercepted him, Manassian gestured with what he wanted the officer to believe was a firearm, in what investigators later described as an attempt at suicide by police response. Constable Lamb did not fire. He arrested Manassian without a shot being taken. What does a court do with a defendant who admits to everything, but insists he was legally incapable of understanding what he did? The trial was held before Justice Anne Malloy. Sitting without a jury, Manassian admitted to planning and carrying out the attack, but entered a plea of not criminally responsible on account of a mental disorder, specifically his autism. On March 3, 2021, Justice Malloy rejected that defense. In her ruling, she described the attack as the act of a reasoning mind and convicted him of 10 counts of first-degree murder and 16 counts of attempted murder. Sentencing came on June 13, 2022, only weeks after the Supreme Court's Bissonnette ruling had struck down consecutive parole ineligibility periods. That timing was decisive. The Crown had sought a term that would keep him behind bars for the rest of his life. The court was instead bound by the new 25-year cap. He received life imprisonment with no parole eligibility for 25 years. The case is still moving through the courts. In July of 2022, the defense filed a notice of appeal challenging the rejection of the not criminally responsible defense. That appeal remains live. In R versus Manassian, decided in 2026, the Ontario Court of Appeal denied a defense motion seeking production of fresh evidence material relating to a Crown expert psychiatrist. The convictions themselves stand. As of 2026, Alec Manassian is incarcerated, serving his life sentence with appeal proceedings ongoing. Manassian acted alone, and the world watched a single man weaponize a rented vehicle. The case that follows turned on the opposite structure. It was a killing plan carried out by a group, an entire chapter of an outlaw motorcycle club, ordered dead by their own. Wayne Kellerstein. On the morning of April 8, 2006, 4 vehicles were found abandoned on a rural road in southwestern Ontario. Inside them were the bodies of 8 men. All 8 had been members or associates of the Toronto chapter of the Bandidos Motorcycle Club. They had been lured to a farm outside Shedden the night before, under the pretense of a routine meeting. They had walked into their own execution. Wayne Earl Kellerstein was born in May of 1949 in Ontario and had spent his adult life in the outlaw motorcycle world, moving through the Holocaust MC, the Annihilators, the Loners, and finally, the Bandidos. He was a Toronto chapter Bandido who had allied with the club's Winnipeg faction. Court evidence at trial suggested he had received orders from Bandidos leadership in the United States to strip the Toronto members of their patches, the club's colors, and by extension, their status. The 8 men killed were all adults. They were John Musketere, aged 48, the national president of the Bandidos in Canada; George Jessam, aged 52; George Kriarakis, aged 28; Luis Raposo, aged 41; Frank Salerno, aged 43; Paul Sinopoli, aged 30; Jamie Flans, aged 37; and Michael Trotta, whose age is given in different court records as either 21 or 31. The killings took place at Kellerstein's farm outside Shedden, near Iona Station, on the night of April 7th into the morning of April 8th. The victims had been invited to what they believed was a club meeting. Once inside the barn, they were disarmed and one by one over several hours, killed. Their bodies were then loaded into 4 separate vehicles and driven a short distance away, where the vehicles were abandoned on a country road. A passing farmer discovered them the following morning. Central to the prosecution's case was a Bandido turned informant who testified under the initials MH, received immunity, and was placed under a new identity. How does a court manage a single trial with 6 defendants and 8 murders? The case was tried in London, Ontario, before Justice Thomas Heaney, and it ran for roughly 7 months, with more than 70 witnesses. Verdicts came on October 29, 2009. Kellerstein, along with Dwight Mushy and Michael Sandom, the last of whom was a former police officer from the Winnipeg area, were each convicted of 8 counts of first-degree murder. Frank Mather and Marcelo Aravina were each convicted of 7 first-degree murders and 1 manslaughter. Brett Gardner was convicted of 6 first-degree murders and 2 manslaughters. Each received an automatic life sentence with no parole eligibility for 25 years. The convictions were appealed and were upheld by the Ontario Court of Appeal in 2015. Final applications to the Supreme Court of Canada were dismissed in 2016. There would be no further review. As of 2026, Wayne Kellerstein is 77 years old and continues to serve his life sentence in federal custody. The convictions in the case are final. His parole ineligibility runs until roughly 2031. The killings on the Kellerstein farm remain the largest mass murder in Ontario's history and one of the defining Canadian cases on outlaw motorcycle gang violence. What it illustrated? That a chapter of a criminal organization could be ordered killed and lured to their own deaths by their supposed brothers. Reshaped how Canadian law enforcement approached these groups for years afterward. The Bandidos case ended 8 lives in a single night. The case that follows unfolded over the opposite scale, a series of killings scattered across 2 decades, in ordinary suburban homes, by a man his neighbors barely noticed. William Patrick Fife. For 20 years, in quiet suburbs around Montreal, women who lived alone were being killed inside their own homes. The pattern was consistent enough that police recognized it. but not consistent enough to link it to any single suspect. The man responsible worked as a handyman. He was described by one detective, after his eventual arrest, as very, very ordinary. It was DNA, not detective work, that finally caught up with him. William Patrick Fife was born in February of 1955 in Toronto and was raised largely by an aunt. He drifted through construction and handyman work in the Montreal area for most of his adult life. He was middle-aged and unremarkable in appearance by the time investigators finally identified him. Little in his outward life had marked him as dangerous, which was part of what allowed him to move through the same neighborhoods for years without raising alarm. His known victims were all adult women, most of them at home alone. They included Suzanne Bernier, aged 55, Nicole Raymond, aged 26, Louise Blanc, aged 37, Pauline Laplante, aged 44, Hazel Scatillon, Anna Yarnold, aged 59, Monique Gaudreau, Teresa Shanahan, aged 55, and Mary Glenn, aged 50. Every killing involved sexual assault and multiple stab wounds. The manner of the attacks was consistent enough that police in more than one jurisdiction eventually saw the pattern. The confirmed timeline runs from 1979, when his first known killing was carried out, reportedly while he was on a day pass from a Montreal jail. Through a sharp escalation in 1999, when he took the lives of 4 women within months. It was that final cluster that broke the case. DNA collected from the crime scenes was matched to Fife, and on December 22, 1999, he was arrested by the Ontario Provincial Police at a truck stop. How many killings can be attributed to one man when the confessions do not match the convictions? The confirmed number is 5. That is what he was ultimately convicted of. A preliminary hearing opened in November of 2000, and in September of 2001, Fife pleaded guilty to 5 counts of first-degree murder. In November of that year, he was sentenced to life imprisonment with no parole eligibility for 25 years, which was among the longest sentences that Canadian law permitted at the time. The story did not end at the sentencing. After his conviction, Fife confessed to 4 additional killings in exchange for a transfer from a Quebec penitentiary to a facility in Western Canada. Those confessions took his own count to 9. No new charges were laid, because he was already serving the maximum sentence Canadian law could impose. Some estimates in true crime research have placed the true figure higher still, though none of those larger claims have been confirmed. The safest count remains what the courts established: 5 convicted, 9 admitted. Fife has also long been suspected, without confirmation, of being a serial rapist who attacked women in Montreal in the 1980s under a nickname the press gave him at the time. That allegation was never formally proven. As of 2026, the public record on Fife's current whereabouts is thin. Reference sources describe him as incarcerated at a maximum security facility in Saskatchewan, with some specifying a psychiatric institution in the Saskatoon area. However, no recent mainstream journalism has confirmed his living status, and no death or parole outcome has been publicly reported. Born in 1955, he became eligible to apply for parole in 2026. Fife went unnoticed for 2 decades. The final case in this record runs the opposite way. It is a killing carried out in the most public building in Quebec, in front of witnesses, on live television, in the middle of a workday. Dennis Lordy. On the morning of May 8, 1984, a man in the uniform of a Canadian Forces corporal walked into Quebec's National Assembly carrying submachine guns and a pistol. He had come to kill the Premier and the elected members of the governing party. The legislature was not sitting that morning. He shot the people who were there instead, messengers and clerks. 3 of them did not survive. And then, in one of the strangest hostage negotiations in Canadian history, the man who had come to kill politicians sat down in the speaker's chair and waited. Denis Lortie was born in March of 1959 in Quebec City. He was serving as a Canadian Forces corporal, a military supply technician stationed at CFS Carp in Ontario at the time of the shooting. In pre-sentencing testimony, he described a childhood marked by physical and sexual abuse, and he was formally diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. His stated motive was rage at the Parti Québécois provincial government, which he had come to believe was destroying Quebec. The 3 government employees killed were adults. They were Camille Lepage and Georges Boyer, both legislature messengers, and Roger Lefrançois, an employee of Quebec's chief electoral officer. 13 other people were wounded. Lortie left CFS Carp on May 7th and drove to Quebec City, where he spent the afternoon quietly touring the Parliament building. He returned the following morning at about 9:45, entered the building openly armed, and began shouting that he had come to kill members of the National Assembly. His plan had been to kill Premier René Lévesque and members of the PQ government. The legislature, however, was not in session, and the elected members he had targeted were not there. He fired into the corridors and offices he did find, killing 3 people and wounding 13 more before making his way into the empty chamber and sitting down in the speaker's chair, where he continued to fire intermittently. What ended the standoff was not a tactical intervention. It was a conversation. The Sergeant-at-Arms of the National Assembly, René Jalbert, walked into the chamber himself and spoke with Lortie for roughly 4 hours. Jalbert, calm and unarmed, gradually persuaded him to surrender. Every person still in the building at the time survived because of that negotiation. Lortie's path through the courts was long. He was convicted of first-degree murder in 1985. But the Quebec Court of Appeal overturned that verdict on the ground that the trial judge had wrongly instructed the jury to reject the psychiatric evidence entered on his behalf. In 1987, at a new proceeding, Lortie pleaded guilty to reduced charges of second-degree murder. He received a life sentence with no parole eligibility for 10 years, a term shorter than any other sentence covered in this record, and one that reflected both the successful psychiatric defense and the reduced charge. He was granted day parole in 1995 and full parole in 1996. He has kept a low profile ever since. As of 2026, Denis Lortie has been living privately, on full parole, for 30 years. The Lortie case is one of the deadliest acts of political violence in Canadian history, and it led directly to increased security at the National Assembly. René Jalbert, the Sergeant-at-Arms whose negotiation ended the standoff, received the Cross of Valor, Canada's highest civilian decoration for bravery. He died of cancer in 1996, the same year Lortie was released on full parole. The case has been cited as a sentencing precedent in later Canadian cases involving mental illness and violent political attacks, including the 2016 prosecution of Richard Bain. 10 cases. 3 decades of Canadian criminal history. Thanks for watching. Click here to see our next video.